The summer air buzzed with anticipation as Jess leaned on the rusted fence, staring at the faded sign that read Wonderland Park. Even though the paint was chipped and the letters were barely legible, there was something both enchanting and eerie about it. The park had been abandoned for years, a forgotten relic from the past that no one seemed to remember or care about, except for Jess and her friends. "Are we really doing this?" Ryan asked, adjusting the camera slung over his shoulder. His excitement barely masked his unease. Jess grinned, her eyes gleaming with mischief. "Oh, come on, Ryan. We've been waiting for a place like this forever. Think of the stories we'll have." Sam, a thrill-seeker at heart, pushed open a gap in the fence, revealing the overgrown path that led into the park. "The internet says this place was shut down after an accident. They say it's haunted," he added with a grin, clearly relishing the chance to dive into another creepy adventure. Mia, the quiet one of the group, wrapped her arms around herself as a shiver ran down her spine. "Haunted or not, it's been closed for over 50 years. Who knows what's still here?" With a nod from Jess, the group stepped through the opening and into Wonderland Park. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional creak of a distant, forgotten ride in the breeze. The pathway was lined with cracked pavement, weeds poking through the stones like nature, reclaiming what humanity had abandoned. Everything was shrouded in a light mist that hadn't been visible outside the park, giving the place an almost otherworldly quality. "Look at that," Sam whispered, pointing to an old ticket booth near the entrance. The glass was shattered, and faded tickets littered the floor inside. A layer of dust and grime coated everything, undisturbed for years. Jess took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of mildew and rust. "I don't know about you guys, but I feel like we just walked into the past." They wandered deeper into the park, passing empty food stands with menus from another era. Cotton candy for a dime, popcorn for a quarter. Rusted Ferris wheels and twisted roller coaster tracks loomed in the distance, their metal frames barely holding together after decades of neglect. Shadows danced across the rides, stretching and twisting like skeletal fingers. "Anyone else feel like we're being watched?" Ryan asked, glancing over his shoulder. Mia nodded, her gaze darting to the shadows. "It's like the park doesn't want us here." "Or maybe it does," Jess replied, her voice laced with an excitement that was almost unsettling. They approached the main square of the park, where a massive fountain stood at the center, dry and cracked, the marble figures frozen in time. At the far edge of the square was an old carousel, its faded horses stuck in mid-gallop. Jess moved toward it, brushing her fingers over the peeling paint. Suddenly, a distant melody drifted through the air, a haunting, echoing tune that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. It was the faint sound of carnival music, the kind that usually played to children's laughter and excited screams. Only now, it sounded twisted, distorted, like a warped memory. "Do you hear that?" Mia whispered, her eyes wide. "Probably just the wind," Sam shrugged, though he didn't seem convinced. Jess, captivated, followed the sound. "There's more to this place," she murmured. "Something hidden." They moved through the park in silence, the music growing louder with each step. Finally, they found themselves at the back of the park, where the foliage was even denser, like a green wall separating them from the rest of the world. There, behind a crumbling barricade and obscured by vines, they noticed something strange, a gateway that didn't belong. The sign above, it read the Forgotten Fair, painted in colors that still held a faint glow, as if untouched by time. "Look at this," Ryan breathed, running his hand over the barricade. "This isn't on any of the maps. It's like it's been hidden away." Jess didn't wait for the others. She ducked under the vines and stepped into the Forgotten Fair. The others followed, drawn by a curiosity they couldn't explain. Beyond the gate lay a section of the park unlike anything they'd seen. The rides were older, built from polished wood and iron rather than the neon and steel of the main park. Every attraction looked like it had been crafted by hand with meticulous detail. Even the paint looked fresh, almost inviting, like the fair had been waiting just for them. As they stepped farther in, the haunting music returned, louder this time, echoing through the empty rides and stalls. It sounded less like a recording and more like an orchestra playing just out of sight. "This place, it feels alive," Mia whispered, looking around with wide eyes. Ryan adjusted his camera, filming the surroundings. "Maybe we're the first people to step in here in decades. Or maybe it's been waiting for us," Jess said, her voice barely a whisper. She reached out, her fingers brushing a beautifully carved figure of a dragon on an ancient ride. A chill swept through them all, as if the fair had been awakened by their presence. The silence thickened as the group took in the details of the Forgotten Fair. The air felt denser here, with a faint scent of old wood and grease lingering around the rides. Jess turned to the others, her face alight with excitement, her eyes darting over each hidden attraction like a kid in a candy store. "Can you believe this?" she whispered. "It's like the park within the park. This has to be the best find we've ever made." Ryan stepped forward, his camera whirring as he captured every eerie detail. The rusted ticket booth, the cobweb signage, and the faded paintings on the rides that still held an unsettling vibrancy. Each attraction seemed almost pristine, too preserved for a place left untouched for so long. Mia rubbed her arms, unable to shake the feeling of eyes on her. "Maybe we shouldn't be here," she said softly, her gaze flitting to the shadows dancing in the corners. "This place doesn't feel right." Sam scoffed, though his usual confidence had softened. "Come on, Mia. You can't seriously be scared of an old amusement park. It's abandoned, remember?" Jess moved toward an old ride labeled the Ferris of Fears, a Ferris wheel that towered over them, its seats decorated with faded, grotesque masks of animals and twisted faces. "I think we should split up, check out the rides individually," she suggested, looking around with that same sense of wonder and curiosity. "There's so much to see, and if we don't cover it all, we might miss something amazing." Ryan looked uncertain, but eventually nodded, his curiosity winning out. "Fine, but let's stick within earshot. We don't know how stable these rides are." The group agreed, each choosing a different path through the hidden fairgrounds. Jess, unable to resist, climbed onto the Ferris of Fears. The moment she sat in the seat, the wheel groaned to life, its mechanisms creaking and whirring despite being rusted and covered in grime. "What the... Did you guys turn it on?" Jess shouted down, grinning at her friends below. They shook their heads, just as startled. Mia called out, "Jess, be careful. This place is practically falling apart." But Jess didn't listen. Her seat ascended into the air, and the higher she went, the more she felt an odd sense of peace. As she looked out over the park, a strange feeling washed over her, like she was drifting back through time, to an era she'd never known. Faces seemed to appear in the distance, faint images of laughing people dressed in old-fashioned clothing. For a moment, she felt like one of them, like she belonged here. But then, something shifted. The faces twisted, becoming grotesque, their laughter turning to screams. The view below changed, warping into visions of abandoned attractions, decaying structures, and shadows with sharp, malicious smiles. She closed her eyes, her grip tightening on the seat, and whispered to herself, "It's just a ride. It's just a ride." On the ground, Ryan filmed, eyes glued to Jess. "Is she seeing something?" he muttered, noticing her tension. Meanwhile, Mia wandered toward the carousel, unable to resist its eerie beauty. The horses were painted in bright but strange colors, their eyes unnaturally wide and their mouths frozen in unsettling grins. She placed a hand on one of the horses, shivering at the coldness of the metal. The carousel whirred to life without warning, and she quickly climbed onto one of the horses to avoid falling. As the ride spun, she became disoriented. The park around her blurred, and soon the reflections in the carousel mirrors showed things that weren't there. Dark shapes, twisted figures that whispered her name. Mia tried to steady herself, but the carousel seemed to pick up speed, her surroundings blending into a dizzying, distorted spiral of colors and shadows. "Stop! Stop the ride!" She screamed, but the carousel only spun faster, the creatures in the mirrors grinning back at her. Sam, who had been eyeing a strange attraction called the Hall of Mirrors, felt a chill run down his spine. Drawn by a pull he couldn't explain, he stepped inside. The hall was dark, lit only by small, flickering bulbs that cast strange shadows across the mirrors. As he ventured deeper, he noticed that his reflection looked slightly off. Every time he moved, the reflection would lag, just a beat behind. Then, it started moving on its own, waving, grinning, whispering things he couldn't quite hear. "Hello?" He called out, his voice echoing through the empty hall. His reflection grinned wider, teeth lengthening, eyes darkening. Sam backed away, feeling trapped, his reflection following him with every step, as if taunting him. A sense of dread clawed at him as the mirror hall seemed to stretch and twist, each new reflection more distorted than the last, each one whispering his name in a dark, chilling tone. Back outside, Ryan was growing increasingly nervous as his friends disappeared from sight. His curiosity and fear wrestled for control. Unable to just stand idle, he decided to check out the House of Clowns, the only remaining attraction nearby. The entrance was painted in loud, bright colors, with a giant clown face grinning down from above. The door creaked open as he approached, revealing a dark, narrow hallway that beckoned him inside. He stepped in, half expecting some kind of jump scare. But the deeper he went, the more oppressive the air became. Shadows loomed, twisted shapes lurking in the dark, and every so often, he caught sight of clowns peering at him from the corners. Their painted faces held expressions that were far too realistic. Faces filled with sorrow, rage, and terror, not the cheerfulness of typical clowns. As he ventured deeper, a chill settled over him, and he felt like he was walking into a trap. Just as he turned a corner, a clown figure lunged toward him, its eyes filled with malice, its mouth twisted into a horrifying grin. Ryan stumbled back, feeling his heart pound as he bolted for the exit, only to find the hall stretching longer and darker with every step. Meanwhile, Jess finally reached the bottom of the Ferris wheel, her face pale and her body trembling. She tried to call out to her friends, but her voice felt faint, as if the park itself was swallowing her words. Mia staggered off the carousel, barely able to stand. Her eyes held a vacant look, and her face was frozen in an expression of fear. She turned to Jess, her voice a trembling whisper. "This place, it's alive. It knows us." Sam and Ryan emerged from their respective attractions, each visibly shaken, each sensing the same unsettling truth, that the Forgotten Fair was no ordinary place. It was as if they had woken something dark and malevolent, something that fed off their fears and refused to let them leave. "What is this place?" Sam whispered, staring back at the twisted attractions, which seemed to loom over them with a newfound hunger. Ryan checked his camera, finding the footage garbled and distorted, as though the park had left its own eerie signature on his recordings. "I don't know, but we need to get out of here. Now." Jess looked back at the Ferris wheel, her gaze lingering. What if there's no way out? A thick silence fell over the group as they realized the extent of their predicament. They had wandered into something far beyond their understanding, a trap masked as an amusement park, a nightmare designed to capture and consume. And with every second they stayed, it seemed the park grew stronger, feeding off their fear, binding them tighter. Together, they moved toward the entrance, hoping beyond hope that they hadn't stepped too far into the grip of the Forgotten Fair. But the haunting melody began once again, echoing through the darkened paths, reminding them that this park had no intentions of letting them go. Ryan clenched his fists as he watched Jess step back onto the Ferris of Fears. Her earlier excitement had vanished, replaced by a haunted look, as if something from the ride was still clinging to her. But in her eyes, he saw a flicker of curiosity, a pull that had already taken root. "Are you sure you're okay, Jess?" Ryan asked, trying to hide the tremor in his voice. Jess forced a smile, but it faltered. I just need to figure this out. It's like something's calling me back." She hesitated before climbing back into the seat, gripping the cold metal bar tightly. The Ferris wheel groaned to life again, as if sensing her presence, and began its slow ascent. As Jess rose higher, her friends below grew smaller, their concerned faces blending into the strange, misty air. A chill seeped through her as she looked out over the forgotten fair, the once exciting allure now twisted into something darker. The higher she went, the more the park's landscape changed. Below, the rides and attractions shifted, like an old film reel flickering with strange, warped images. Her heart pounded as she caught glimpses of dark figures among the shadows, watching her, their faces twisted and hollow. As her seat reached the peak, a memory surfaced, unbidden and raw. It was the last fight she had with her father. She was a teenager, full of anger and rebellion, and his words still echoed in her mind. "You'll never amount to anything, Jess. All you care about is yourself." The memory clawed at her, more vivid and intense than ever, as if it had a life of its own. She could see his face, twisted with disappointment, and feel the sting of her own words in response. A weight settled on her chest, pressing down, suffocating her. It was as if the Ferris wheel itself was forcing her to relive the memory, trapping her in an endless loop of guilt and anger. "No, this isn't real," Jess whispered, squeezing her eyes shut. But when she opened them, the vision only intensified. Now, her father's face was in front of her, lifelike and close enough to touch. But something was off. His eyes were empty, hollow pits, and his mouth stretched into a grotesque smile. He reached out, his cold hand brushing her cheek, his voice a hollow echo. "You'll always be alone, Jess. This is what you deserve." Jess tried to scream, but the sound caught in her throat. She was frozen, paralyzed by the weight of her own fears and regrets. The Ferris wheel lurched, and her seat tipped forward, dangling her over the park, leaving her staring into the depths of her past. Below, Ryan watched helplessly as Jess convulsed, her body locked in place, her face pale and eyes wide with terror. "Jess! Jess, can you hear me?" he shouted, but she didn't respond. Her mouth moved, whispering words he couldn't hear. Panicking, Ryan turned to Sam and Mia. "Something's wrong. It's like the ride is doing something to her." Mia's face was etched with fear. "Maybe we should try to stop it. Pull her off, or something." Without another word, Ryan ran to the control panel beside the ride, which was covered in grime and spiderwebs, untouched for decades. Desperation overriding logic, he yanked a lever, hoping to stop the ride. But instead of halting, the Ferris wheel groaned, picking up speed, sending Jess higher and faster into the night. Back in her seat, Jess was trapped in a twisted reality. The Ferris wheel had become her own personal hell, each rotation dragging her deeper into memories she had long buried. Each face she saw was twisted, judgmental, accusing her of every failure, every mistake, every lie she had ever told. She screamed, her voice swallowed by the howling wind. "Stop it! Let me out!" But the ride continued its relentless pace, as if feeding off her fear. Her vision blurred, and suddenly, she saw herself, sitting alone in the same Ferris wheel seat, pale and lifeless. Her face was frozen in terror, her eyes empty. She was staring at her own corpse. "No, this can't be real," she cried, clutching her head, willing herself to wake up from this nightmare. But the seat beneath her felt solid, cold, grounding her in the dark reality. As Jess spiraled into despair, her grip on the bar slipped, and for a brief, terrifying moment, she felt herself falling. She braced for impact, but the fall never came. Instead, her seat jolted, and the Ferris wheel began to slow, the ride finally releasing its hold. When her feet touched the ground, Jess stumbled, her legs weak, her mind reeling from the ordeal. Her friends rushed to her side, worry etched on their faces. "Jess, what happened?" Mia asked, her voice trembling. "You were screaming. We tried to stop the ride, but—" Jess looked at them, her eyes hollow. "It showed me things. Things I didn't want to remember. It was like the ride knew what I was afraid of, like it was feeding off my fear." Sam frowned, casting a wary glance at the Ferris wheel. "Maybe we should leave? This place isn't normal, Jess. It's like it wants to trap us here." Ryan nodded, a nervous energy radiating from him. "We should go, now." But as they turned to leave, the haunting carnival music echoed through the fairground once more, louder and more distorted, as if mocking them. The fair was alive, and it had no intention of letting them escape so easily. Jess looked over her shoulder at the Ferris of Fears, the ride now eerily silent, its seats swaying gently in the breeze. She could still feel its pull, the lingering sensation of being trapped, and an unsettling realization settled over her. They weren't just in an abandoned amusement park. They were in a trap, a place that knew their fears, their regrets, and their weaknesses. A place that wouldn't rest until it had consumed them entirely. As they took hesitant steps back toward the entrance, the shadows lengthened, creeping across the ground as if following them. The ride seemed to watch them with a sinister patience, biding their time. And deep down, Jess knew that whatever had happened on the Ferris wheel was just the beginning. The group hurried through the forgotten fair, every creak and whisper from the park gnawing at their nerves. Jess still looked shaken, her face pale, her eyes unfocused as she relived the terror on the Ferris of Fears. Sam, Mia, and Ryan exchanged worried glances, but none of them dared to speak what they all felt. The park wasn't letting them go. The carousel, at the center of the fairground, stood out in eerie contrast to the other attractions. Unlike the rusted, broken-down rides they had seen, this carousel appeared untouched by time. Brightly painted horses lined the circular platform, each with its own unique, intricately carved features. However, the colors were oddly muted, with the reds and blues giving off a faint glow in the dim light. The animals' eyes looked almost lifelike, wide and gleaming with a strange intensity that sent a chill through Mia as she approached. "I don't know about this," Mia whispered, feeling the weight of a dozen eyes on her. "It doesn't feel right." "Maybe we shouldn't touch it," Sam replied, though he too felt drawn to the carousel's strange allure. The haunting call of the fairground music echoed again, distant yet tantalizing, inviting them forward. Jess shook her head. "After what happened on the Ferris wheel, maybe it's best we don't touch any of the rides." But the carousel seemed to have a pull of its own, an almost magnetic force that Mia couldn't resist. Without thinking, she reached down, her fingers brushing the mane of a horse, cold as stone. The moment her hand touched it, the carousel sprang to life, the platform creaking and whirring as it slowly began to turn. Startled, Mia tried to pull back, but her feet seemed to have a will of their own, and before she realized it, she had climbed onto one of the horses. The others called out to her, their voices muffled, as if an invisible barrier separated her from them. "Mia, get off!" Ryan shouted, his voice laced with panic. But Mia couldn't respond. The carousel picked up speed, the world around her blurring into an endless spiral of shadows and distorted shapes. The park seemed to vanish, leaving her alone on the ride, spinning through a dark, empty void. As the ride spun, the mirrors surrounding the carousel's center began to glow faintly, casting distorted reflections. In the mirrors, Mia caught glimpses of herself. Not the present-day version, but versions from her past, moments she had tried to forget. One reflection showed her as a child, standing alone at her parents' funeral, her face pale and tear-streaked. Another reflection flashed to her teenage years, her expression filled with guilt after a friend's betrayal. Each image was a piece of her past she had buried, and now they all stared back at her with hollow eyes and accusing expressions. "No," she whispered, clutching the metal bar of the horse. "This isn't real. It can't be." The carousel spun faster, the images in the mirrors morphing, twisting, showing her moments she had long hidden from herself. She saw her mistakes, her regrets, each one amplified and warped, playing out in a horrifying cycle. It was as if the carousel was dragging her through the darkest corners of her soul, making her confront every fear, every flaw. A reflection in one of the mirrors began to change. Instead of the young girl at her parents' funeral, she saw herself now, pale and terrified, her face twisted into an expression of horror. But the figure in the mirror moved independently, staring back at her with a knowing smile, one that was almost mocking. "You belong here," her reflection whispered, though Mia's lips hadn't moved. "No, I don't," she stammered, feeling the grip of the carousel tighten around her. "This is a nightmare. I just have to wake up." But the figure in the mirror leaned closer, its face contorted into something almost monstrous. "There is no waking up. You can't run from what you've done, Mia. It's all waiting for you here." The carousel slowed, but the grip of fear tightened. Her heart pounded as she felt herself slipping, her sense of reality unraveling with each beat. The ride finally stopped, but her legs felt like they were made of lead, and her mind was lost in the horrors she had just relived. Outside, Ryan, Jess, and Sam could only watch helplessly as Mia sat frozen, her eyes wide and glassy, her face drained of color. Jess reached out, pulling her gently off the horse, but Mia barely responded, her gaze fixed on something only she could see. "Mia, can you hear us?" Jess asked, her voice shaking. Mia blinked, her eyes slowly coming into focus. She glanced at her friends, but her face held a haunted expression, as if she were only half present. It showed me things," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Things I didn't want to remember. It was like I was trapped inside my own nightmares." Ryan looked back at the carousel, the haunting music echoing faintly, as if taunting them. "This place is alive. It knows us, our fears, our memories. It's using them against us." Sam nodded, glancing warily at the other rides. "This isn't just an abandoned amusement park. It's something else, something darker. It's like the park feeds on fear, on memories." The group stood in tense silence, the weight of the park's malevolent presence pressing down on them. Jess swallowed hard, glancing back at the Ferris of fears and then at the carousel. "If we stay here, it'll destroy us, one ride at a time." But as they turned to leave, the path they had come down now appeared different, darker, twisted, and seemingly endless. The ride seemed to close in around them, casting long shadows that stretched like skeletal fingers. The unsettling realization hit them all at once. The Forgotten Fair had no intention of letting them go. The weight of the Forgotten Fair pressed heavily on them as they ventured deeper into the park, each step feeling like it pulled them further from any hope of escape. Mia was still pale, her hands trembling as she clung to Jess, the memory of the carousel's dark visions haunting her with every step. Ryan and Sam walked in silence, each casting wary glances at the rides around them, as if expecting them to spring to life and drag them back into another nightmare. Ahead, a twisted, half-broken archway led into a strange attraction. A faded sign hung crookily above the entrance, reading the Hall of Mirrors. The entrance itself was dark, with only the faintest glimmer of light reflecting off the glass inside, casting eerie shadows onto the path before them. But something about the Hall of Mirrors tugged at Sam, as though the darkness within called out to his own hidden fears, challenging him to confront them. He swallowed, trying to shake off the feeling, but it was no use. A strange compulsion pulled him forward, despite his better judgment. I think I need to go in there," Sam whispered, his voice barely audible. Jess grabbed his arm, her eyes wide with fear. "Are you crazy? You saw what happened to us. This park is trying to break us, Sam. We should stick together." But Sam shook his head, pulling his arm free. "It's like something in there is calling me. I need to see what it wants." Without waiting for a response, Sam stepped into the Hall of Mirrors. The others hesitated, sharing uneasy glances before finally following him inside, their fear overridden by the loyalty that bound them as friends. The entrance gave way to a narrow, winding path lined with mirrors on both sides. The air inside was thick and stale, tinged with a faint metallic smell that prickled at their senses. As they walked, they noticed that each mirror reflected back their images, but something was off. The reflections didn't move in sync. Instead, they lagged a beat behind, like silent, mocking echoes of themselves. Sam moved ahead of the group, his eyes fixed on a mirror that stood at the center of the hall. He was drawn to it, hypnotized by the reflection staring back at him. Except it wasn't him, not entirely. The figure in the mirror wore his face, but its eyes were sunken and hollow, its mouth twisted into a haunting smile. "What is this?" he whispered, reaching out to touch the glass. As his fingers brushed the mirror's cold surface, his reflection suddenly moved, pressing its own hand against his, trapping him in place. The reflection's eyes flashed, darkening as it spoke in a voice only he could hear, a voice that sounded like his own but laced with malice. "Welcome, Sam. We've been waiting for you." The others watched in horror as Sam seemed to freeze, his eyes locked on his reflection. His expression twisted from curiosity to fear, then to pure terror. He began to tremble, his breathing shallow as the reflection continued to whisper, its voice sinking deep into his mind, dredging up memories he had tried to bury. The mirror showed scenes from Sam's past moments of betrayal, guilt, and regret. He saw a younger version of himself, back in high school, laughing with friends as they bullied another student. He remembered the cruel taunts, the laughter, and the shame that followed him long after that day. It was a memory he had pushed aside, but here it played out in vivid, haunting detail, as if forcing him to relive every second. "No, I'm not like that anymore," he whispered, his voice cracking. The reflection only smirked, its eyes narrowing with malice. "Aren't you, Sam? You can try to hide, to pretend you're different, but deep down, you know the truth. You can't escape who you are." Sam's body trembled as more memories surfaced. Fights with friends, broken promises, mistakes he had made and never forgiven himself for. Each memory twisted, warped by the mirror, made worse than it ever was in reality, until he could hardly tell what was real and what was distorted by his own guilt. Outside the mirror, the others called out to him, their voices faint and distorted, as if coming from a great distance. "Sam, snap out of it!" Ryan shouted, grabbing his friend by the shoulders, but Sam remained entranced, his gaze locked onto the reflection's haunting eyes. Then, as if possessed, Sam's reflection spoke louder, its voice echoing through the hall. "This is where you belong, Sam, in the dark, trapped by your own mistakes." Jess grabbed his arm, trying to pull him away from the mirror, but he was rooted in place, his fingers glued to the glass. She felt a chill spread from his skin, as though the mirror was draining him of warmth, of life. "Sam, please," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Come back to us." Slowly, Sam turned to face her, his eyes hollow, his face pale as if he'd aged years in seconds. I can't. It won't let me go." The figure in the mirror sneered, its eyes glinting with twisted satisfaction. "You're already one of us, Sam. You can't leave." With a surge of desperation, Ryan lunged forward, slamming his fist against the mirror. The glass cracked, shattering the reflection into 100 twisted fragments, each one reflecting pieces of Sam's fear and guilt. The glass splintered, and suddenly, Sam staggered backward, released from the mirror's grip. He stumbled, collapsing to his knees, his body trembling as he gasped for air. The others gathered around him, their faces etched with relief and fear. "Sam, are you okay?" Mia asked, her voice shaky. Sam nodded weakly, though his face was still pale, his eyes haunted. It showed me things I didn't want to see. It was like it knew everything I hated about myself, everything I've ever regretted. He looked up at his friends, his voice barely a whisper. "I don't think this place is just haunted. I think it's alive. It wants us here." They exchanged uneasy glances, realizing that Sam's ordeal was only a fraction of what the park had in store for them. Every ride, every attraction seemed designed to confront them with their darkest fears and memories, feeding off their emotions, drawing them deeper into its web. Ryan glanced back at the cracked mirror, his fists clenched. "We have to find a way out. Whatever this place is, it's not letting us go without a fight." Jess nodded, her face set with determination. "Then we stick together, no matter what. If we're going to escape, we have to keep moving. We can't let this place get to us." As they turned to leave, a chill settled over the hall, the shattered pieces of the mirror glinting ominously in the dim light. The reflections seemed to watch them, fragmented and distorted, each piece a reminder of the horrors lurking within the forgotten fair. With every step, the park seemed to shift, the walls closing in, the shadows stretching longer. They were no longer simply exploring an abandoned amusement park. They were wandering through a twisted living nightmare, one that knew their every secret, every fear. And as they left the Hall of Mirrors, the faint sound of laughter echoed through the air. A laughter that was not their own, but a hollow, mocking sound that followed them, promising that this fair was far from done with them. The group pressed forward, their nerves frayed and their spirits weakened. Each of them bore the scars of the forgotten fair, haunted by memories and visions that the park had dredged up from their pasts. But they knew they couldn't stop. The only way out, they hoped, was through. As they walked, the faint music of the park continued to drift through the air, that haunting, twisted melody winding through the empty attractions like a whisper in the dark. Ahead, a grotesque building loomed. A large, faded clown face painted above the entrance, its wide eyes staring lifelessly, its mouth stretched into a manic grin. Above the door, a chipped sign read "The House of Clowns." The words were painted in vibrant colors, now dulled and peeling, but somehow the face still looked disturbingly alive, as if it were watching their every move. Ryan shivered, the sight of the clown's face triggering a deep-seated fear he had carried since childhood. His steps slowed, and he fought the urge to turn and run. "Do we have to go through there?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Sam, trying to muster a show of confidence after his ordeal in the Hall of Mirrors, placed a hand on Ryan's shoulder. "We've made it this far. We can't stop now. Besides, maybe it's a shortcut." Mia and Jess exchanged worried glances. They knew the park had been targeting each of their weaknesses, each of their fears. They had seen it with the Ferris wheel, the carousel, and the Hall of Mirrors. Now, it seemed, it was Ryan's turn. Ryan clenched his fists, swallowing his fear. "Fine, let's go." But as they stepped inside, he couldn't shake the feeling that the park was watching, anticipating his every move. The interior of the House of Clowns was dimly lit, the faint glow of colored lights casting eerie shadows along the walls. The air was thick with the scent of dust and mildew, mixed with a faint, lingering hint of carnival popcorn. They moved cautiously down the narrow hall, flanked on either side by painted clown faces, each one more distorted and twisted than the last. Some clowns had wide, toothy grins, while others bore expressions of sadness or rage, their eyes hollow and dark. The group moved in silence, their footsteps echoing through the empty hall. Ryan's heart pounded, his fear growing with each step. The sight of the clowns stirred up memories he tried to bury, a childhood fear that had been born from a single terrifying experience, being locked in a basement by an older cousin, trapped in the dark with nothing but an old clown doll staring back at him. Its painted smile burned into his mind. Ahead, the hallway opened into a larger room filled with mirrors and more clown faces painted on the walls. In the center stood several life-size clown mannequins, their faces frozen in exaggerated smiles, their glassy eyes staring blankly forward. Mia shuddered, taking a step back. Why do they look so real? Ryan swallowed, unable to look away from the mannequins. He tried to tell himself they were just props, but something about them felt wrong. Their painted smiles seemed to widen as he stared, and he swore he saw one blink. "Let's keep moving," Jess urged, tugging at his sleeve. But as they stepped forward, a sudden clanging echoed through the room. The door behind them slammed shut, trapping them inside. The lights flickered, and a low, mocking laugh filled the air, as if the clowns themselves were laughing at their fear. Ryan's heart raced as he looked around, panic gripping him. This is just a joke, right? Some leftover effect or something. But then, one of the clown mannequins shifted, its head turning slowly toward him, its painted eyes meeting his. The mouth creaked open, revealing rows of sharp, metallic teeth that glinted in the dim light. "Welcome to the show, Ryan," it rasped, its voice hollow and mechanical, yet filled with a dark, twisted glee. Ryan stumbled backward, tripping over his own feet as the other clowns came to life, their movements jerky and unnatural. They stepped forward, surrounding him, their eyes glinting with malice. The once lifeless figures now moved with eerie precision, their smiles stretching into horrifying, unnatural shapes. The others tried to pull him back, but the clowns closed in, their laughter filling the room, a cacophony of high-pitched, mocking voices that seemed to claw at Ryan's mind. "You'll never escape us," one of the clowns whispered, its cold breath brushing against his ear. "We're everywhere. We're inside you." Ryan's vision blurred as he felt himself being drawn into the nightmare, the clowns' faces melting and warping, becoming indistinguishable from one another. His own reflection in the mirrors around him twisted, showing him as one of them. A painted, grotesque version of himself, with a wide, maniacal grin and hollow, empty eyes. "Stop it," he shouted, his voice raw with terror. He covered his ears, trying to block out their laughter, but the sound was inside his mind, echoing, reverberating, pulling him deeper. Jess, Sam, and Mia tried to break through the circle of clowns, reaching out to Ryan, but the clowns held him fast, their cold hands gripping his arms and shoulders, pulling him closer. "Ryan! Snap out of it!" Sam yelled, grabbing his friend's arm and shaking him. For a brief moment, Ryan felt himself break free, his vision clearing. He saw his friends' faces, their eyes wide with worry, their voices calling him back. But then he looked around, seeing his reflection once more, the clown version of himself grinning back, mocking him. "You'll be one of us, Ryan," it whispered. "You belong here." Desperation surged within him, and with a final, frantic burst of strength, he tore himself from the clown's grasp, stumbling backward. The moment he broke free, the lights flickered, and the clowns froze, returning to their lifeless state. Breathing heavily, Ryan collapsed to the ground, his face pale, his body shaking. He could still hear the laughter echoing in his mind, a sound that would haunt him long after they escaped this nightmare. Jess knelt beside him, her hand on his shoulder. "Ryan, are you okay?" He nodded weakly, though his eyes were distant, his mind still trapped in the horror he had just experienced. They showed me myself, but not me, like I was one of them. I was trapped, just like them. Mia looked around, her face pale. This isn't just some abandoned park. It's alive. It's like it's trying to turn us into something else, to make us part of it. Sam helped Ryan to his feet, his gaze fixed on the clowns. If we don't leave now, I don't think any of us will make it out the same. If we make it out at all. The group gathered their strength, casting one last fearful glance at the clowns before moving toward the exit. But as they stepped away, the faint sound of laughter followed them, the clowns' empty eyes watching, their painted smiles forever frozen in mockery. Outside the House of Clowns, the fairground seemed to shift, the shadows growing darker, deeper, as if the park itself was closing in, pulling them further into its twisted embrace. And as they walked, the faint music of the fair grew louder and endless, haunting melody that reminded them that the forgotten fair was not done with them yet. The group moved through the fairground with heavy, haunted steps, their faces etched with fear and exhaustion. Each of them had faced something in the forgotten fair that stripped them bare, exposing their darkest fears and deepest regrets. But now, a chilling realization settled over them. They were running out of time. They had entered this cursed park together, but it was clear that each attraction they encountered was designed to tear them apart. As they approached the central plaza, where they had first discovered the hidden section of the fairground, the park seemed to pulse with a dark energy. The rides loomed around them like silent predators, waiting for their next move. The Ferris wheel, the carousel, the Hall of Mirrors, and the House of Clowns all stood still, yet there was an unmistakable feeling of watchful anticipation. Jess stopped in the middle of the plaza, looking around, her face pale but resolute. "We have to face it," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "This place, it's feeding off our fears. It won't let us leave until it's had its fill." Ryan, still shaken from his encounter in the House of Clowns, looked around, desperation flickering in his eyes. What are we supposed to do? Just give ourselves to it? Sam shook his head. No, there has to be a way out. We can't just surrender. Maybe if we stay together, we can beat it. Break whatever hold it has on us. Mia's gaze wandered to the rides surrounding them, her voice trembling. But what if we're already trapped? What if this was the park's plan all along, to bring us here and keep us? A hush fell over them as they absorbed her words. Deep down, they all felt the same gnawing fear, that they were already bound to the forgotten fair, woven into its twisted fabric. It wasn't just a place they had entered. It was a trap they had willingly walked into. Suddenly, the air grew thick, and the temperature dropped, a chill sweeping through the plaza. One by one, the rides began to hum to life, their lights flickering weakly, casting an unnatural glow over the fairground. The haunting melody of the carnival music filled the air once more, louder than ever, echoing through the night as if the park itself were laughing. Before they could react, shadows began to gather at the edge of the plaza. Dark, ghostly figures emerged, their outlines blurred and shifting, like faint remnants of people who had been there before. Each figure seemed bound to one of the rides, standing motionless as they stared at the group, their eyes hollow, their faces expressionless. Who are they?" Mia asked, her voice barely audible. Jess took a step back, a terrible understanding dawning in her eyes. "I think they're the others. The people who came here before us." The figures stood in silence, their eyes locked on the group. Each one looked worn and lifeless, as if they had been drained of all color and warmth, left as empty shells. They were bound to the rides that had claimed them. A man stood by the Ferris wheel, his face frozen in a grimace of terror, while a woman lingered near the carousel, her expression vacant, as if lost in an endless loop of despair. Ryan's hands trembled as he realized what he was seeing. They didn't escape, did they? They became part of the park. One of the figures, a young woman with hollow eyes, took a step forward, her mouth opening as she spoke in a voice that sounded like a faint, distant echo. "You shouldn't have come here," she whispered, her words laced with sorrow and warning. "Once you enter the Forgotten Fair, you belong to it. We all belong to it." The group took a collective step back, the gravity of their situation sinking in. They were standing in the presence of those who had been claimed by the park, their souls forever bound to its cursed attractions, unable to escape. Jess clenched her fists, anger and defiance flashing in her eyes. "No, we're not going to end up like you. There has to be a way out. There has to be." But the figures only stared back at her with pity, their faces filled with an understanding that came from experience. They had tried to escape, too. They had fought against the park's hold, struggled to free themselves from its grip. And now, they were nothing more than shadows, remnants of people who had once lived, trapped in an endless nightmare. The young woman looked at Jess, her eyes softening with a hint of sympathy. "The park feeds on fear. It traps you with your own memories, your regrets, your nightmares. As long as you're afraid, it will never let you go." Sam looked at his friends, desperation flashing in his eyes. "Then we can't be afraid. If we want to get out of here, we have to fight it, together." The figures began to fade, their bodies dissolving into mist, leaving the group alone once more. But their words lingered, a chilling reminder that they were now part of something far darker than they had imagined. Jess took a deep breath, steeling herself. "Okay, we're gonna face this. No matter what happens, we don't give in. We don't let the park win." The others nodded, their expressions grim but determined. They knew that the park would throw everything it had at them, but they were resolved to fight, to push back against the fear that threatened to consume them. As they moved forward, the ride seemed to react, each one stirring to life, its lights glowing brighter, its mechanisms whirring with renewed energy. The Ferris wheel spun, the carousel creaked, the mirrors in the Hall of Mirrors glinted with dark reflections, and the House of Clowns echoed with faint laughter. One by one, each friend faced down their fears once more, but this time, they fought back. Jess confronted the specter of her father in the Ferris wheel, rejecting his accusations and freeing herself from the guilt that had haunted her. Mia rode the carousel, staring down the twisted memories of her past, finding strength in her own resilience. Sam braved the Hall of Mirrors, shattering each distorted reflection with determination, defying the memories that sought to trap him. And Ryan, trembling but resolute, stood face to face with the clowns, their mocking laughter echoing around him, and refused to give in to the terror they inspired. Together, they fought through their nightmares, pushing past the fear, breaking the park's hold one memory at a time. The fairground trembled, its lights flickering, the shadows pulling back as the friends reclaimed their strength, defying the darkness that sought to claim them. Finally, as the sun began to rise, casting a pale light over the fairground, the music faded, and the rides fell silent. The shadows receded, and the park grew still, as if it had been drained of its energy. Exhausted but triumphant, the friends gathered in the plaza, the weight of the night lifting from their shoulders. They had faced the Forgotten Fair and emerged on the other side, scarred but stronger. Without a word, they turned and walked back toward the entrance, leaving the silent fairground behind them. But as they reached the edge of the park, Jess glanced back, her gaze lingering on the Ferris wheel, which now stood dark and lifeless. The remnants of the park's victims watched from the shadows, their faces softening with a hint of peace, as if freed by the friends' defiance. And as the last of the group stepped beyond the gate, the Forgotten Fair sank back into its silence, waiting patiently for the next visitors who would wander into its grasp. For the friends it was over, but the fairground and the dark force that powered it would always be there, lurking in the shadows, a twisted reminder that once you enter the Forgotten Fair, a part of you always belongs to it. As dawn broke over the abandoned fairground, the first rays of sunlight cast a pale glow across the Forgotten Fair, illuminating its eerie, still attractions. The rides, which had once pulsed with dark energy, now lay dormant, their menacing lights extinguished, their mechanisms silent. Yet the sense of unease lingered in the air, as if the fair were only resting, biding its time. The group, battered and weary, made their way out of the park in silence. Jess, Ryan, Sam, and Mia were grateful for the relief that washed over them as they stepped beyond the boundary, feeling the weight of the park lift from their shoulders. They had survived, escaping with their lives and reclaiming their fears. But each of them knew they would never truly be free of the Forgotten Fair. They moved toward their car, parked in the overgrown lot just beyond the fence. The fairground loomed behind them, fading into the distance, its silent rides watching them leave. None of them dared to look back, not wanting to risk another glimpse into the horrors they had just escaped. Once they reached the car, Jess slumped against the side, her face etched with exhaustion. "We did it," she whispered, her voice filled with both relief and disbelief. "We actually made it out." Ryan nodded, his face pale but determined. "Barely. I don't think I'll ever be able to look at a carnival the same way again." Mia gave a weak smile, though her eyes were distant, haunted by the memories the park had forced her to confront. Do you think it's over? That the park will just stop?" Sam shook his head, glancing back at the towering gate, the words "the Forgotten Fair" barely visible through the mist. "I don't think it will ever stop. Not until it finds someone else." A heavy silence fell over them as they realized the truth. The Forgotten Fair was no ordinary place. It was something darker, something alive, feeding off the fear and regrets of anyone who dared to enter. They were lucky to have escaped, but the fair would always be there, waiting, lurking in the shadows, ready to claim the next unfortunate souls who wandered into its grasp. They climbed into the car, the engine sputtering to life as they pulled away from the lot. But as they drove, an unshakable feeling settled over them, a sense that they hadn't left the fairground entirely behind. The memories of the rides, the twisted visions and reflections, clung to them like shadows, reminders of what they had faced and barely survived. As the road stretched ahead, they lapsed into silence, each of them lost in thought. They didn't speak about the fair or the horrors they had encountered. They didn't need to. The fear, the memories, were imprinted on them, scars that would remain long after they left the fair behind. Back at the fairground, the mist rolled in, settling over the rides, obscuring them in a blanket of fog. The Ferris wheel loomed in the distance, its seats swaying gently in the breeze, as if waiting. The mirrors in the Hall of Mirrors glinted faintly, reflecting dark, twisted shapes that seemed to dance within their frames. And the clown figures in the House of Clowns stood motionless, their painted faces frozen in eerie smiles, watching, waiting. In the heart of the park, near the dry, cracked fountain, the ghostly figures of past victims gathered, their hollow eyes fixed on the gate, watching as the car disappeared into the distance. Their faces held a faint glimmer of peace, as if the group's escape had given them a brief reprieve from the endless nightmare. But the fairground's pull remained, and they knew it wouldn't be long before the fair's dark hunger would call new visitors to fill the void. Suddenly, a soft sound broke the silence. A crunch of gravel, the faint hum of an engine. From a distance, another car appeared, winding down the narrow road toward the fairground. It was filled with a group of young travelers, their faces alight with excitement and curiosity, eager for a new adventure. The ghostly figures watched in silence as the newcomers parked near the entrance, their voices echoing with laughter as they approached the rusted gate, unaware of the horrors that awaited them within. They took pictures, marveling at the eerie beauty of the abandoned park, drawn in by the allure of its mystery, the thrill of exploring something forbidden. One of them spotted the faded sign above the gate, the Forgotten Fair, and grinned, nudging his friends. "Looks like we found the perfect place for our next ghost hunt." With a final laugh, they stepped through the gate, crossing the threshold into the fairground. The mist thickened, swallowing them up as the eerie silence returned, blanketing the fair in an almost suffocating stillness. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the rides began to hum to life once more. The Ferris wheel creaked as it turned. The carousel lights flickered. The mirrors gleamed with dark reflections, and faint laughter echoed from the House of Clowns. The fairground was awake again, its dark energy renewed, ready to feed on the fears of the next unsuspecting visitors. Back in the car, miles away, Jess glanced at the rearview mirror, catching a final glimpse of the road behind them. For a brief, chilling moment, she thought she saw the outline of the fairground gate in the distance, the faint lights flickering as if calling her back. But when she blinked, the image was gone, leaving only the empty road. She turned forward, her hands gripping the wheel tightly, her mind clouded with a sense of dread that wouldn't fade. They had escaped, but they all knew that some part of them would always remain in the Forgotten Fair, bound to its dark secrets, haunted by its twisted memories. And as the car disappeared down the road, the fairground fell silent once more, settling back into the mist, waiting patiently for its next visitors. The Forgotten Fair had no end, no mercy, and no escape. It was eternal, a place that existed beyond time, beyond reality, luring in the curious, the brave, and the foolhardy. For those who entered, a part of them would always remain, bound to the park's twisted attractions, just as Jess, Ryan, Sam, and Mia had barely managed to break free. Because in the end, once you entered the Forgotten Fair, a piece of you stayed forever, waiting to draw in the next unsuspecting souls. And so, the fairground waited, knowing it would never be truly alone, its existence bound to those foolish enough to seek it out. The lure of eternity was a powerful thing, and the Forgotten Fair would never rest. It would always wait, its dark carnival music echoing in the mist, calling out to those who couldn't resist its deadly allure.